When you think of prayers that shook the foundations of heaven and changed the course of history, you might picture thunderous intercessions echoing through marble temples, desperate pleas shouted from mountaintops, or perhaps eloquent petitions delivered by robed prophets before vast crowds of witnesses. Maybe you imagine Moses pleading for his people in the wilderness, or Elijah's dramatic showdown with the prophets of Baal, or Daniel's 3-week fast that moved heaven's armies into action. But sometimes the most earth-shaking prayers are the ones nobody hears, whispered through tears in the quiet corners of sacred spaces, breathed by broken hearts that have nowhere else to turn but up. Her name? Hannah, a woman whose silent, desperate prayer would birth not just a son, but a prophet who would reshape an entire nation's relationship with God. She wasn't a queen or a prophetess, but a wife caught in the cruel grip of empty arms and an emptier womb. Her story unfolds not in palaces or battlefields, but in the intimate spaces of longing, where hope and heartbreak dance together, where faith wrestles with disappointment, and where sometimes the most profound miracles begin with the quietest prayers. Hannah's story is written in the language every woman understands. The ache of waiting, the weight of others' expectations, the courage it takes to keep believing when everything visible suggests your dreams are dead. Her legacy wasn't built in boardrooms or carved on monuments, but whispered into existence in a moment of raw, honest desperation that would echo through generations. Our story is set in the hill country of Ephraim, during one of Israel's darkest spiritual seasons. This was the time of the judges. Think of it as ancient Israel's equivalent of societal chaos, except instead of doom-scrolling through troubling news, people were witnessing actual corruption in their holiest institutions. The priesthood was compromised, spiritual leadership was failing, and the entire nation was like a ship without a compass, drifting further from the God who had called them his own. Picture a society where the very people meant to represent God were stealing from his altar, where moral authority had crumbled, and where ordinary people hungry for spiritual truth had nowhere reliable to turn. It was into the spiritual vacuum that God was preparing to send a prophet. But first, he needed a mother willing to pray one into existence. Hannah lived in this broken world, but her personal pain made the national crisis feel almost secondary. She was married to Elkanah, a good man who loved her deeply. But Elkanah had another wife, Peninnah. And here's where Hannah's story becomes every woman's nightmare of comparison and inadequacy. Peninnah had children. Hannah did not. And in a culture where a woman's worth was often measured by her fertility, where childlessness carried not just personal heartbreak, but social shame and economic insecurity, Hannah was living every day with a grief that touched her very identity. But Peninnah wasn't content to let Hannah grieve quietly. Oh no. She made it her personal mission to remind Hannah of her barrenness at every opportunity. The Bible says she provoked her severely, which is Hebrew for being the kind of person who comments on your weight at family gatherings. Except instead of your appearance, she was attacking the deepest wound in Hannah's heart. Imagine the daily torture. Every giggle from Peninnah's children, every proud moment when they achieved new milestones, every casual conversation about parenting became a fresh reminder of Hannah's empty arms. It was psychological warfare disguised as domestic life, carried out by someone bound to her by marriage, but certainly not by mercy. Most of us would have cracked under this pressure. We'd have become bitter, stopped attending family functions, maybe even walked away from faith altogether. But here's what makes Hannah extraordinary. Year after year, through tears and taunts, through hope deferred and dreams denied, she kept showing up to worship. Every annual pilgrimage to Shiloh, every religious festival, every opportunity to draw near to God, Hannah was there. Not because she felt spiritual, not because worship came easily, but because her faith ran deeper than her feelings. She chose to believe that the God who seemed silent still heard her, that the God who felt distant still cared about her pain. And then comes the moment that changed everything, not just for Hannah, but for an entire nation. During one of these pilgrimages, Hannah's grief reached a crescendo. Unable to eat, overwhelmed by the weight of years of waiting and wanting, she slipped away from the family celebration and made her way to the tabernacle. There, in the presence of the God who had allowed her womb to remain closed, Hannah did something that would revolutionize prayer itself. She didn't recite memorized words or follow prescribed formulas. Instead, she opened her heart like a floodgate and let her raw, unfiltered anguish pour out before the throne of heaven. But this wasn't your typical temple prayer. Hannah wasn't standing at the altar making public petitions or following religious protocols. She found a quiet corner, and there, in the most vulnerable posture imaginable, she whispered her desperation to the only one who could truly understand. Her lips moved, but no sound emerged. It was heart speaking directly to heart, soul crying out to soul. Her prayer was specific, sacrificial, and stunning in its boldness. Lord of hosts, if you will look upon the affliction of your servant and remember me, and give me a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life. This wasn't bargaining, it was surrender at its most costly. Hannah wasn't trying to negotiate with God. She was offering him everything, including the very blessing she was begging for. Think about the breathtaking faith this required. Hannah was essentially praying, God, give me the one thing I want most in this world, and I promise to give it entirely back to you. It's like begging for your dream home and promising to turn it into a homeless shelter the moment you get the keys. Most of us struggle to give God our spare change. But Hannah was offering her firstborn before he was even conceived. Now here's where the story takes an almost tragicomic turn. Eli the priest, the man who should have been spiritually sensitive enough to recognize sincere prayer when he witnessed it, watched Hannah's silent, soul-deep petition and concluded she was drunk. This is the same Eli whose own sons were so corrupt they were stealing from God's offerings, and he assumes the problem is a woman having too much wine during worship hours. Picture the scene. Hannah, probably with mascara running down her cheeks, if they'd had mascara, pouring out her heart in the most sacred moment of her life, only to have the religious authority figure tap her on the shoulder and suggest she sleep it off. It's like going to your pastor for prayer in your darkest hour and having him recommend a detox program instead. But Hannah's response reveals the grace woven into her character. She doesn't explode in righteous indignation or storm out in wounded pride. Instead, she gently corrects his misunderstanding. No, my lord, I am a woman troubled in spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord. Her words carry such dignity, such patient explanation in the face of being completely misunderstood by the very person who should have been shepherding her heart. Even in her pain, even when wrongly accused, Hannah chose grace over defensiveness, truth over retaliation. Eli, recognizing his error, blesses Hannah. Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition. And here's where we see faith in its purest form. Hannah's entire countenance changes. Not after she gets pregnant, not after she sees the positive test, but immediately after she pours out her heart to God. She goes away, eats food, and is no longer sorrowful. This is what trust looks like. Hannah didn't wait for visible proof before she started believing God had heard her. She understood that sometimes peace comes not from getting what we want, but from releasing what we want into God's capable hands. And the God who collects every tear in a bottle, who hears every whispered prayer, who knows the heartbreak behind every closed door, he remembered Hannah. She conceived and bore a son, naming him Samuel, because I have asked for him from the Lord. But here's where Hannah's true character blazes in all its glory. She kept her impossible promise. When Samuel was weaned, probably around age 3, when his chubby little hands would have been clinging to her skirts and his voice calling, "Mama," would have been the sweetest sound in her world, Hannah packed his tiny belongings and took him back to Shiloh. Picture this heart-wrenching scene. A mother who had waited years for this child, who had endured mockery and misunderstanding, who had prayed through tears and darkness, now placing her toddler's hand in Eli's weathered palm. Her words should be etched in gold. For this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted me my petition. Therefore, I have lent him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he is lent to the Lord. Most of us have trouble giving God our leftovers, our spare time, our extra money. Hannah gave God her heart walking around in a 3-year-old body. She surrendered not just her son, but her daily hugs, her bedtime stories, her front row seat to his first words and growing wisdom. But the story doesn't end in sacrifice. It explodes in song. Hannah's prayer of thanksgiving in 1 Samuel 2 is one of Scripture's most beautiful hymns, a prophetic masterpiece that would later echo in Mary's Magnificat. Her words overflow not with possessive joy, but with recognition of God's faithfulness to the broken, His power to lift up the humble, His delight in using the unlikely to accomplish the impossible. And Samuel? He became the prophet who would anoint kings, who would call a nation back to God, who would bridge Israel's chaotic past with its golden future. Hannah's whispered prayer produced the man who would identify David, the shepherd boy who would become Israel's greatest king, whose lineage would eventually bring forth the Messiah himself. From Hannah's moment of desperate prayer flowed streams of blessing that would water generations. Samuel's godly leadership, David's psalms, Solomon's wisdom, the establishment of a worship system that would point hearts toward heaven for centuries. Her willingness to release her most precious gift became the seed that grew into a forest of blessing. Hannah teaches us that God specializes in impossible prayers. When our circumstances feel hopeless, when well-meaning people misunderstand our pain, when the waiting stretches longer than we think we can bear, God sees, God hears, and God's timing is perfect, even when it feels painfully slow. She also shows us that true faith isn't just asking for blessings, it's being willing to release them back to the giver. Hannah didn't just pray for a son, she surrendered him. She didn't just receive her miracle, she invested it in God's greater purposes. Sometimes the most profound act of worship is letting go of the very thing we've cried ourselves to sleep praying for. In our culture of accumulation and possession, Hannah reminds us that influence comes through release, that legacy is built through surrender, that sometimes the prayers that change the world are the ones whispered by broken hearts who've learned to trust God more than their circumstances. Her story whispers hope to every woman walking through infertility, every person feeling forgotten by heaven, every believer wondering if their tears are falling on deaf ears. Hannah's legacy lives on every time someone chooses faith over bitterness in the waiting, worship over withdrawal in the pain, surrender over self-protection in the answered prayer. So wherever you are in your story, whether you're whispering desperate prayers in hospital rooms, crying out for prodigal children, or wrestling with dreams that seem to have died, remember Hannah. Remember that the God who opened her womb specializes in impossible things, that the prayers whispered through tears often echo loudest in heaven, and that your willingness to release your deepest desires into God's hands might just be the key that unlocks blessings beyond your wildest imagination. Your silent prayers matter. Your tears are precious to Him. Your willingness to trust when you can't see the outcome might just be the foundation for miracles that extend far beyond your own life. After all, if one woman's whispered prayer in an ancient tabernacle could birth a prophet who would reshape a nation's destiny, just imagine what God might do through your faithful surrender today. Thank you for joining me in this tender story of faith, waiting, and surrender. If Hannah's journey touched your heart, subscribe for more biblical narratives that reveal how God works through ordinary people in extraordinary ways. Because Scripture is filled with stories of faithful hearts whose private struggles became testimonies of God's unfailing goodness. Until next time, keep praying, keep trusting, and never underestimate how God can use your season of waiting to birth something beautiful beyond your dreams. After all, if a mother's silent prayer could echo through eternity, imagine what God might do with yours.